Hello, this is my video on exchange rates, which is part of Economics A2 level Unit 4. It's the penultimate video in the Unit 4 series. An exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of another, so at the moment it costs 1.35 euros to buy a pound, so that's an example of an exchange rate. Now, with a floating exchange rate, which can sort of go up or down depending on market conditions and that sort of thing, we'll look at it in a lot more detail later, they can either go up in value or down in value, so appreciation of an exchange rate is the rise in value of a floating currency. So say the currency was originally 135 euros to buy a pound. Now if it's 140 euros to buy a pound, then it's appreciated, whereas depreciation is if it's gone down. So before it was 135 euros to buy a pound, now it's 120 euros to buy a pound. Exchange controls are essentially restrictions on the ability to trade foreign currencies, so they might be imposed by a country's central bank, and these tend to lead to a more fixed exchange rate. We'll look at that in a lot more detail later. Notable examples of this are China and India. We definitely did those at GCSE, so if you did GCSE, you might remember in the Section 3 video for GCSE we looked at that. First, we're going to look at the floating exchange rates, and floating exchange rates are essentially influenced by demand for a currency, and this demand can come from a number of areas you can see on the screen. So, for example, if we want to purchase another country's goods or services, we have to demand their currency first in order to buy it, so we'll have to sell some of our pounds, buy some of the euros to buy any goods or services from within the Eurozone. If we want to invest in another country's firms, we're going to have to demand for their money, their currency. If we're speculating, so say we think that the euro is going to suddenly rise in value, we might buy some of their currency so that then we make profit from doing that. And finally, if we want to place funds in another country's bank, and this is mainly if they've got a higher rate of interest, which is why if you have a higher rate of interest, you can often see a strengthening of your exchange rate. With these diagrams here, we can have a look at the impacts of a change of demand. So say we've got a rise in demand for the dollar from UK citizens, so we're going to be selling the pounds to buy the dollar, which is increasing the supply of the pound and also increasing demand of the dollar. So the increase in demand of the dollar, as you can see on the left diagram there, has led to an increase in the price of the dollar in terms of the pound. So that's led to a strengthening of the dollar, so the dollar has appreciated in value, whereas because we've been selling the pound in order to buy the dollar, the supply has increased of the pound, which means that the exchange rate has depreciated against the dollar. If you've got a question about exchange rates in the exam and it's floating exchange rates, that's definitely a great diagram to draw, because you've got two diagrams straight away which they'll give you marks for, and it's a relatively easy explanation, so it's quite a lot of easy marks, analytical marks. Let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of a floating exchange rate. The first advantage is that it balances the current account. So say we've got a deficit at the moment, so money is going out of the country. The country's exchange rate will actually depreciate in response to this because we're buying more goods, we're increasing supply of the pound to buy more goods from abroad. That's going to lead to a depreciation in our exchange rate, so the value of our currency, which means that our exports are going to fall in price, because you know when the exchange rate weakens, your exports look more attractive to people abroad, so that'll lead to your exports being more competitive, and because they're buying more and more of your exports, you're going to see a reduced deficit on the current account. So that's definitely a really, really good reason to have a floating exchange rate, and I think Milton Friedman talks about that in one of his books. The second one is there'll be a lot less speculative pressure, so because those who are buying and selling currency at different prices to make a profit are less sure of how they will change, because it's all down to the market, totally external of governmental control, they're much less likely to have lots of big movements of hot money, because it's much more risky to do it when there's no government control involved. And the final one is there's less foreign exchange reserves, so the government, because we're not needing to maintain exchange rate at a fixed level, we don't need to have loads and loads of money of all different types of currency in our reserves, which is just a happier, more comfortable position to be. Looking across to the other side, disadvantages, it might not actually balance the current account at all, and this is particularly where price elasticities of demand come into play. If you've got a really inelastic good or service, no matter what your exchange rate is, having a floating exchange rate isn't going to make any difference as to whether people are going to buy the good or service or not, because they're either going to want it or they're not, and the price isn't going to have any impact. So it's not really a disadvantage, it's just counteracting your advantage there that it balances the current account. So that's some really great evaluation you can do quite easily. And obviously you've got your PED in, which is a nice impressive point to make. Domestic inflation, you can't actually control currency depreciation, and if there is currency depreciation, you're going to see rising import prices, which can be inflationary. Whereas if you've got a fixed exchange rate, you're able to ensure that there isn't too much currency depreciation, so import prices don't rise up too much, so you can control inflation a lot more easily. That's why a lot of people have a fixed exchange rate, not just because it makes your exports more competitive, but also you can help to control inflation to a certain extent. Uncertainty. If you've got no exchange controls, any massive capital flows, for example hot money, even though it is less likely, if there is some, it can be very, very destabilising, which can lead to sudden changes in the exchange rate. And if you have sudden changes in the exchange rate, say your imports suddenly become a lot less attractive abroad, there's going to be massive unemployment really, really quickly. Or say import prices rise suddenly, you're going to see a massive rise of inflation very suddenly, and it can take quite a while to put policies in place to reduce these. Then we've got still some level of control. So we've said there's less foreign exchange reserves, but we still do have some level of control over the floating exchange rate. A lot of people don't have a totally free floating exchange rate. They have some control over it. So we're still going to have some foreign currency reserves to maintain this sort of optimum value as such. And finally, some exchange rates will still be fixed. So say we've got China and India and they've fixed their exchange rates, there might be advantage against you. So say they make their exchange rates particularly weak, they're going to have an advantage competitively on the international market because their exports will simply seem so cheap. Now we're going to look at the exchange rate index, often shortened to ERI. I don't think you really need to know about this too much, but it basically compares the exchange rates between trading partners. So there's a higher index for those with greater trade value. And the index basically measures the average price of domestic goods against the trading partners' prices, which sees sort of what the exchange rate roughly is. And there's also, say you trade with 5 different countries, there's going to be different weighting, so the level of trade with the country will determine the weight for that country. So this is going to give you an exchange rate index across lots of countries. So a country that has a fall in their ERI is actually having a weaker exchange rate, which leads to the costs of imports rising, which leads to rising inflation in the home country, which obviously isn't ideal. There are quite a few factors that affect exchange rates, floating exchange rates in particular, and these are relative interest rates, inflation, FDI, and current account deficits. So relative interest rates, say we've got an increase in the UK interest rate. That means it's more attractive for people to put their money here because they get more money in return for them holding it here. So that leads to flows of hot money into the UK. Though the UK basically sees an increase in demand for the pound and therefore a rising value of the pound. If you draw that on a demand and supply diagram, increase in demand always leads to an increase in price, well usually does. So then we're going to see a decrease in the relative price of imports and an increase in the relative price of exports because we've got a strengthening exchange rate, which isn't great because it leads to a reduction in the UK price competitiveness, and also because imports are cheaper. Whilst that's good on the one hand because it means there's less inflation, it's bad because it means that we're going to import rather than buy domestically, which leads to deindustrialisation and eventually unemployment in a lot of cases. Second one is inflation. Say we've got inflation in the UK, imports seem a lot cheaper than domestic produce because imports may not have inflation abroad. So we're going to import more, whereas our exports are going to seem expensive abroad because we've got inflation pushing up prices, so we export less. This leads to a depreciation in the value of the pound because there's much less demand for the pound and there's a much bigger supply because we're selling it to buy other currencies. So this is going to be good because it's going to lead to a weakening exchange rate. A weaker exchange rate means cheaper exports and more expensive imports, which leads to a more balanced balance of payments. So on the one hand, because our exports are falling in price, whilst it's good because it means they're more competitive, we're also going to see less revenue coming in from them. We're going to make less profit on them, so we need to export more. So then we have more need for spare capacity in the economy and stuff like that to increase our exportation. And if the UK hasn't got much spare capacity, say we're already on our PPB, this can be quite a big issue. On the one hand, it can also lead to increasing inflationary pressure as well because imports are expensive and we do rely on imports for a lot of things. It's going to not only push up prices just in general because import prices are rising, but it's also going to push up the prices of the stuff that we're producing to sell abroad or domestically because we import raw materials from abroad. That leads to a rise in the cost of production. If you draw that on your demand and supply diagram, it leads to a left shift in supply, which is going to increase the price. FDI, that's a really quick one. Basically, if we have increasing flows of capital into the country for long-term investment, that's an increase in demand for a country's currency and therefore the appreciation in the value of the currency. And finally, we've got a current account deficit. Basically, if we've got a deficit, it means we're importing more than we're exporting. So there's going to be an increase in the supply of the pound and a decrease in demand for the pound, which is going to lead to a fall in the value of the currency, depreciation in the value of the currency. I'm afraid this slide on fixed exchange rates might take quite a while to do because there's quite a lot of information here, but I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. Basically, back in the good old days, exchange rates were actually fixed against other currencies, so we all had fixed exchange rates, but then changes in market pressures led to the misalignment with the market rate of the exchange rate, which meant that people gradually moved towards floating currencies, but we still have a few economies which do have fixed exchange rates, so their exchange rate is very fixed against other currencies. However, it's actually quite difficult to maintain these fixed exchange rates due to changes in market pressure, and we've got some examples here. So, for example, inflation. If we've got inflation, the values of currencies are changing massively, because obviously if you've got inflation, the actual value of the pound is going to be falling, so that's obviously going to have an impact on the exchange rate. Growth differentials. If we've got some economies who are growing really fast, their currency is naturally going to appreciate, and if you've got a fixed exchange rate, it is really hard to stop this from happening without using massive amounts of money. And finally, speculation. Basically, if we have significant flows of money, large governments can be forced to change exchange rates. So say that speculators felt that a currency was overvalued and it was only being maintained at that rate, maybe due to high interest rates and that sort of thing. They might sell the currency, leading to hot money leaving the country because they're worried that it's not going to maintain that value and they think it's going to fall in the future. And then the speculators are going to buy the money again at a lower price. So authorities might actually be forced to devaluate a currency and reduce its value in order to stop speculators from selling the currency. So this could be quite dodgy because it could lead to them having to increase the interest rates, which obviously can put a halter on economic growth, or they might need to raise a loan to purchase currency, and that'll lead to borrowing, and borrowing in debt is a horrible thing for a government to get involved in. Plus, the size of the loan you'd need would be massive, so that'll lead to lots and lots of hot money, and hot money can lead to horrible things happening with exchange rates. On the other hand, if speculators feel that currency is undervalued, they might buy lots of currency, which will lead to hot money going into the country because they think they can make a massive profit by buying the currency now whilst it's undervalued, and that will force authorities to increase the value of a currency by revaluating it, and that can obviously cost money and stuff like that. So fixed exchange rates don't tend to work. When they do work, though, this is how it sort of works. If we look at the diagram here, we've decided to fix the exchange rate at PF. That is our fixed exchange rate, but then for some reason there's an increase in demand for our currency. Maybe lots of people want to buy our exports, that sort of thing, which leads to a disequilibrium because demand has shifted from D1 to D2, and this will increase the supply of the dollar back to A. So originally it was at B, and now it's going to be at A because we've shifted the supply curve of the dollar rightwards. However, this will only work in the short term because eventually the foreign currency reserve will run out, so the government's going to be forced to do something else. So it'll either have to allow the exchange rate to float or reduce the demand for the dollars in the UK, which is going to be either a deflationary policy or it's going to mean that our exports become less competitive, which isn't great for anyone. Basically, nobody has an unlimited amount of dollars that we can sell in our foreign currency reserves. We've got to be careful to maintain our fixed exchange rate at a price which is sustainable in the long term, because obviously sometimes there will be fluctuations up and down which can balance each other out, but if it's too much in one direction that can lead to us leading to a situation in which we simply can't afford to maintain it at that level. That was quite a complicated slide. I found it quite complicated. So this slide is a lot nicer. It's quite simple. It's just basically variations of the fixed exchange rate policies. So we could have an adjustable peg or a crawling peg. So an adjustable peg basically means that the value of the fixed exchange rate changes as circumstances require. So governments will do quite sudden changes in the fixed exchange rate in order to get it to the level they want it in the exact moment. Whereas with a crawling peg, there's basically frequent changes in the value of the fixed exchange rate, leading to gradual changes in the value. So basically lots and lots of small changes rather than the adjustable peg, which will be very big, quick changes in the exchange rate as and when they're needed. So fixed exchange rate pros and cons. The first pro is business certainty. So basically, if we have a stable currency, businesses are very aware of the price they're going to receive for an export and the cost of materials from abroad because our currency is going to be fixed against theirs. So we're always going to know how much we're going to get in and how much it's going to cost to sell out, that sort of thing. The second thing we can do is control inflation. So basically, we can maintain a strong exchange rate, which means that imports are going to be relatively cheap, which means that we can keep our inflation levels low, which keeps us competitive internationally, although having a strong exchange rate obviously makes our exports less competitive on the international market. Furthermore, in order to maintain an exchange rate at this level, a strong exchange rate, we're going to have to use deflationary policies, and they tend to be unpopular because they lead to less demand in the economy and that sort of thing. The last point is increased international trade, and this is more back in the day than now. Basically, back in the day, because everyone had fixed exchange rates, no country was able to gain an unfair competitive advantage by allowing the currency to depreciate. So say we had a balance of payments deficit and we wanted to reduce this, we'd just let our currency depreciate until we could afford to sell more and import more. So basically, we'd keep depreciating it until it was at a level at which we felt our balance of payments deficit would start to decrease, or it'd be more attractive size for us. But when we've got fixed exchange rates, obviously we can't do this, which leads to much more stability in terms of currency value and that sort of thing. And stability leads to people being able to better make business decisions and purchasing decisions, which led to more purchasing and stuff from abroad and more international trade. So that's basically the pros of a fixed exchange rate. However, it's quite obvious that there's lots of disadvantages to a fixed exchange rate, because otherwise we'd all have them, and one of those is speculation. So basically, if a country has got a trade deficit and a fixed currency, they basically, all the speculators will think, they're going to devaluate their currency in order to reduce their deficit, and there'll be lots of speculation against the currency, and people are going to start selling the currency, leading to lots of hot money leaving the country, which is really bad, and anything that the government does to try to prevent this from happening, any action they take, is going to be a massive drain on reserves, so it can be quite expensive to maintain it at such a level. Furthermore, it leads to a reduced rate of growth, so any deflationary policies that you use in order to keep your exchange rate at the level you want it to be at is going to prevent you from growing, because obviously deflation means that people are going to keep waiting for prices to fall further and further and further, and so they're not going to be buying, which leads to a massive fall in AD, and any fall in AD can lead to unemployment and all sorts of horrible things. The final one is that fixed exchange rates do need regular revision, because different countries are going to have different changes in growth and different changes in inflation, and the exchange rate does need to change in order to prevent you from having permanent trade deficits or surpluses. We saw in the balance payments video, I think it was the last video, that we can't have a long-term deficit or a surplus for lots and lots of reasons. So fixed exchange rates can be quite expensive to maintain at the level you want them to be maintained at, and also just to ensure that is the level you actually want it to be maintained at. And obviously you don't have to worry about that nearly as much if you've got a floating exchange rate. So some clever soul basically thought, let's have a managed float, which means that the currency is free to fluctuate between two levels. So we've got some floating between two levels, but it's still fixed to an extent that it is controlled by the government and that sort of thing. Also, interesting point here, the levels that the government fixes it at, which is the ceiling price and the floor price, they have to say between those two sort of levels, are actually undisclosed by the government to prevent anyone from speculating. Because if people knew what these levels were, if it got close to one level or the other, one ceiling price or the floor price, speculators might think, it's time to put lots of money in or take lots of money out because the government's about to have to revaluate or devaluate or that sort of thing. And obviously if we do depart from the target, if we do reach these levels or pass these levels, there's going to have to be central bank intervention. So let's have a quick look at the two levels. The ceiling price is basically the maximum price of the currency determined by the authorities. So the price isn't allowed anywhere above this sort of price, because exports would then become too expensive abroad and would be less competitive, and that would lead to horrible deindustrialisation and that sort of thing. So if we do go above this sort of ceiling price, the authorities will have to sell our currency in order to increase supply. And that means we'll be buying other currencies, which is good because we're adding to our reserves for if we go below. So if we go down to our floor price, which is the minimum price determined by the authorities, if we do go to below this level, the authorities will have to buy currency. So we're going to have to sell our reserves in order to increase demand for our currency and therefore lead to it appreciating again. Price isn't allowed anywhere below this level because imports would become too expensive, which would lead to inflation. The second type of float is not really an official float as such, it's basically a dirty float, which when there's a manipulation of a floating rate in order to gain advantages over a trading partner. So say you've got a floating exchange rate, but then you alter it from time to time in order to basically have maybe cheaper exports, that sort of thing, in order to be more competitive. That's called a dirty float. Not sure when you're ever going to need to know that, but may as well know it if it's in my notes here. Woo! That's the end of the video. Sorry it dragged on a bit and my voice is really croaky. And also this isn't really my favourite topic, exchange rates. I mean, it's one of the most interesting topics, although the EU's next, and that's going to be really interesting. I think it's one of the harder ones to sort of explain without moving diagrams and stuff that I'm not cool enough to do. But I tried, so sorry if it's not good enough. Anyway, have a lovely day. See you next time to learn about the European Union. Bye!